All right, welcome Bright Talk to our August monthly Threat Intel Cyber Lookback. With me today, as normal, you know them, you love them, Peter Rudzinski and Joey Fitzpatrick. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for hopping on for this month's episode.
So good to see you.
Absolutely. Now, before we jump into the news, the reason why we're coming to you later than the first Tuesday or Thursday of the month is that we were actually at Black Hat. Yes, it was not canceled. It did go live. And so it was not just a marketing event this year for IronNet. The beauty was we were actually hand selected to work inside the NOC. And the NOC is the defensive, the basically security operations center for the entire event. They replace all of the hardware at the Mandalay Bay Convention Center, and then they invite a number of organizations to help defend the conference. So the beauty of this is Peter Rudzinski was actually there in the NOC the entire time, defending the entire operation. So, Peter, I'm going to kick it over to you. Tell me what you saw, how it went, and your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I mean, you hit it there on point. I think the biggest thing I want to point out is that this is, the companies that get brought into the NOC are, obviously responsible for keeping everything up and running and everything. But for the most part, you don't have the ability to pay your way into this into this group. This is not a paid thing. It's not a sponsorship or a partnership of any kind. It's really based on merit and whether your product can actually provide a critical service for the conference in general. So the companies that were invited are typically regularly invited. And so in this case, we were the new addition, but the regularly attending companies were Lumen as the ISP, which actually was two dual links for redundancy to ensure that we had network connections even if things went badly on one. We also had Palo Alto there providing the firewalls and the web application defensive positions, as well as Ruckus for our switching. This was another new addition, I believe, and actually a company I hadn't really heard too much about, so it was interesting to see them involved in this. And then we also had Gigamon there, who we've done a lot of work with, obviously, given the fact that our product is a PCAP-based solution, and Gigamon is the leading PCAP sensor and duplication service. And the cool thing about Gigamon being here actually is that they brought their, one of their most capable machines to provide that tapping infrastructure, which actually had a complete power independent failover, which I thought was very, very cool. Given the fact that it's fiber, they were able to split that fiber and have a side channel just in case power went out that actually allowed the signal to continue to pass through, even if they weren't able to maintain power on the system. So we would lose tapping, we would lose all the configurations of actually how the monitoring side works, but the critical services and actual internet could flow if we were to lose power or something like that to that machine. So really cool sensor there. And then as far as the security suite that we had deployed, it was Cisco for intelligence, as well as some endpoint defensive solutions that they brought, which I thought was another pretty cool call out here, is that they had some like Mac, or I should say iPad-based endpoint protections, given the fact that there were iPads that were used for registration. They were able to defend those with an endpoint agent. We also had RSA's NetWitness there. They're a longtime supporter of the NOC, and they provided some additional network hunting capabilities and network monitoring. And then obviously IronNet was there. So really excited to join the crew. Everybody was super welcoming, and I think we complemented the security posture of the NOC very well. Great engagement, and really glad to have been there. And hopefully we can show up for the future Black Hat events as well.
Yeah, and I got a chance to get in there and hang out with you guys for a bit, and then interview Grifter, which was really cool. So that's on socials on IronNet and my personal LinkedIn. But it was really cool talking about, hey, we're searching for a needle in a pile of needles, which is kind of sounds dangerous. But what he meant was it's Black Hat, right? There's a bunch of labs going on. There's a bunch of people testing new vulnerabilities and exploits. So what is supposed to be there in a lab environment versus what is somebody actually using in a malicious nature, right? And how do you differentiate? And it makes the job of for you, Peter, and the group there that much more difficult. So it was a really interesting perspective to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like the analogy that Grifter provided there. It's something I haven't actually heard before, but it really does capture the exact problem that we have when going in to defend this network is, obviously, as you mentioned, we've got labs, we've got all sorts of learning courses that are going on that you would expect to see potential exploits flying by, whether that be, for red team activities or whether that be for defensive learning around how to defend against and detect these types of exploits. So ultimately, our job is very tricky because this is not a standard enterprise network. We don't have a history of behavior to lean on and look at, what hosts were doing and things. So it was definitely challenging moving into this. But ultimately, I was really excited because we were actually able to have a couple pretty solid findings as well. Additionally, again, I think that it was just really cool to see all of the companies come together and complement each other in their capabilities and differentiate between what we need to care about and just standard black hat shenanigans that go on.
I love it. Now, would you do it again if invited back?
Absolutely, yeah, no doubt. And I think we will be, we're unsure yet of all the logistics and everything, but we're really excited to hopefully be back at future Black Hats. This doesn't include just USA. This includes some of the other Black Hat Singapore, as well as Black Hat Europe over in London. So really hoping to continue to support that.
That would be fantastic. And I look forward to seeing you there, hopefully. And Joey, maybe someday you could join us.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let's jump into it, guys. We're about 5 minutes in. So that is our Black Hat recap. Thank you, Peter, so much for jumping into that. Next up on the list is, you probably heard about it. You may have even Googled it. Cassia Ransomware. If you Google it, this was Peter's actual screen grab where he Googled it, and it happened on July 2nd. Now, once again, if you didn't get the headline, basically it was a hot July. Over 2,000 organizations were affected by this attack. It was linked to REvil, and then they misspelt it here in this specific article, I believe. But basically, they used Kaseya's remote computer management tool to launch the attack after getting into their DevOps lifecycle. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you, Peter. Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, it's funny, the that screen grab that you presented there, as we were going through preparing for this webinar, I did a quick Google search on Kaseya to see what would pop up, and thought it was really interesting that the Google recommended answer there, as you can see, like the Google produced answer was actually that they were ransomwared on July 2nd. And this just sort of speaks to the just the nature of the world we live in nowadays, and how your reputation is defined by some of these major incidents, and preventing them, especially when it comes to supply chain attacks, and being the sort of responsible party for enabling a supply chain attack like this is bad. And you can see how that manifests itself. And even if somebody Googled your service, as if they were an interested customer or something, the first thing they would see is, hey, you've been ransomwared. And you dig deeper and it looks out, they find out it's not just Kaseya that was ransomware. It was actually their customers through their usage of that product. And so I think this is going to definitely damage the reputation in their bottom dollar, because there's just no way that you can move past something like, again, a security violation that affects your customers directly. And anecdotally, but something that I had heard from some of the incident response companies while we were at Black Hat, it was really, really cool, because I was able to talk to some of the incident response companies and some of the guys who actually stepped in and helped the companies deal with this issue. They were saying that even though it may not be the most prudent thing to do, many of these companies are stepping away from using the VSA application simply because they don't trust Kaseya anymore. And again, whether that's the best course of action, given the fact that Kaseya is likely going to lock their stuff down very heavily at this point, it does send a strong message that says, I don't care, if you're going to, fix it after the fact. I care that you didn't do it in the beginning. And so we're going to, speak with our money and move away from you as a service. But I'd like to give it to Joey so he can dive into how this attack actually worked, and maybe provide some details surrounding, what actually took place and who was affected.
Yeah, let me go ahead and let me pull up that timeline for you, Joey. If you want to walk us through, I mean, this is kind of basic. This, what does a 0-day vulnerability timeline look like? Will you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure, they actually, back in April of this year, they actually disclosed this vulnerability, this web application vulnerability to Kaseya. So as you can see here, they discovered it. Then they disclosed it to the vendor saying, hey, this is something you guys should work on. And it turns out Kaseya was actually working on the fix for this, and they were very close to releasing it. But, a few days later, is actually getting compromised by that threat actor there. And so, actually back to Pete's point, this is the thing that happens with a company, right? In the sense that you could be good 90% of the time and do all the right things and have vulnerabilities disclosed to you, work on the patch of it. But then it makes you wonder is how did they know that they're going to release that patch so soon, right? And how did they, how does a company kind of thwart that, right? Because now your reputation is tainted by this one event. So again, you can be good 95% of the time, although I don't think that was true here in this case with Kaseya, but if you're good 95% of the time, but that 5% or the 1% you slip up, that's kind of what you're going to be known for in the future, right? So this is really hard. And this is really send a warning signal to folks like Screen Connect, TeamViewer, right? If MSPs really trust you to be their de facto software to help manage all these devices, you have to be locked down. You have to take this stuff seriously. And you should, whether it be through a third party or internal team, actually go and try to pen test your own software to make sure that it is secure so this doesn't happen in the future. But let's pivot back to the attack. So this was an authentication bypass vulnerability that was present in the VSA actually web interface here. And it allowed the threat actors to circumvent this authentication, upload a malicious payload, and then actually deliver that malicious payload to an MSP, all the MSP's customers, right? So one VSA server, multiple customers. And this is something we do all the time in sysadmin world, right? Where you're gonna say, oh, it's VSA, it's trusted, so we're gonna whitelist that directory, right? Safe list it. And then what happens is your antivirus goes, okay, good, we're never gonna scan that, right? And so when that happens, right, we say this is inherent trust. This is very similar to an insider threat. You're saying, oh, they would never do anything wrong. We totally trust them. And then what happens? Malicious payload gets in, it's trusted by all the endpoints, begins encrypting. So super dangerous here. What was cool, I think, on from visibility perspective was Huntress, who is a managed detection response team, actually live blogged the events in real time, got on Reddit, and was asking folks who had this in their environment to share the different audit logs and any logging they had that was at that time to actually discover, one, how did they get in, and then two, how are they propagating around the network. Later turns out that this affiliate from REvil did not actually propagate really through the network. Once they were on the network, they began encrypting, which kind of leads to some of the aftermath here is they didn't actually get all the money they wanted to because they didn't go after backups and network shares immediately and begin encrypting those first. Companies were able to actually recover the backups without having to pay the fee for encryption, right? So good for us, right? But it should be really serious to take a warning to, like, this is no joke. And this could have crippled easily 2,000 businesses in just a single month. So something we have to really pay attention to. So REvil got, a lot of flack for this, as you can imagine, especially a lot of attention from different nation states. Europe and the United States paid heavily attention to this. It really contributed to President Biden really putting pressure on President Putin, say, hey, if this is something that's going to happen in your backyard, either you need to take care of it or we're going to. And so that's yet to be seen. Not sure what that looks like in the future, but hopefully we begin to, as a country, take this more seriously and begin to knock out these ransomware groups.
Well, I think you said some really interesting things, right? You said, hey, you might whitelist those directories, right? So the fake update was pushed. But I think something really interesting happened was along those lines, it was actually a legitimate Microsoft Windows Defender executable that was older that was used as the REvil encryptor as well, right? So they're using these known, I mean, everybody uses Microsoft Defender. They just use an older vulnerable version to then push and use as their encryptor. So it wasn't stopped anywhere. Now, you're right. They didn't laterally move. They pushed the fake update. VSA uses Kaseya as an agent. So you can have, the one Kaseya to rule them all kind of view, but it encrypted all of the devices that had the agent on them. And I think that's what made this really devastating. But you're right. They didn't do their due diligence. They didn't go after those backups and file shares. And Kaseya actually said, hey, we got the decryptor back and we didn't pay the ransom. Now, that was a month later, so organizations had already begun the incident response procedures. But no, great intel, Joey.
Yeah, I just want to step in there and highlight something that you mentioned, Joey. We've said this before, I think, when we were talking about one of the other ransomware attacks. I forget which one, but ultimately, I really like that the verbiage you used here, which is some of these services and how attackers are leveraging legitimate applications as an avenue into a network like the VSA application. It really does almost look like insider threat, as you mentioned. I mean, these are things, trusted applications, things that are leveraged regularly, and you just sort of turn a blind eye and say, hey, that's good to go. And so it kind of is an interesting way to look at it, is that it is actually insider threat. And I think that's something that hopefully companies will pay a little bit more attention to, as we saw with literal insider threat from a human perspective, where at first companies didn't even think about training their users or even looking at their employees as potential threats, whether that be intentional or unintentional. But I think you're going to start seeing that a lot more nowadays, where companies think twice about how they're deploying administration software like this.
Yeah, to continue that point, Pete, what's scary is, we moved from endpoint detection that was also signature-based, and then we moved more to like behavioral analysis. That's a good change, right? But what's happened is that software companies don't develop with security always in mind. And so what happens is you may interact with the operating system, which might be in a way that's construed by antivirus EDR system as a bit malicious or suspicious. And so then what they say is like, well, we don't know how your EDRs can actually handle this, so it's just best if you just whitelist the whole directory. And so I'd be curious out there, how many sysadmins are actually whitelisting line of business applications that are like that, or just acting suspiciously. So it goes back to, again, we have to put pressure on software companies to develop with security in mind. Sorry, Joel, to cut you off here.
No, not a problem. And I think that leewayed really into, look, I'm even helping a couple organizations do vendor security reviews, right? And vendor due diligence. And one of my questions is, hey, what is the security you're implementing around your DevOps lifecycle? Some have implemented EDRs, some haven't, right? Some have policies around it, some haven't. But you look at something like SolarWinds, where they had injected this DLL into the build cycle. They had turned off the pragma statements, logging, right? They turn it off, inject DLL, turn it right back on. It was monitoring it every second for that compile sequence. That does sound very insider threat. Like, you have to know that DevOps lifecycle in order to be able to do stuff like that. And we have to do a better job at ensuring and asking the hard questions to the companies providing software to us.
Yeah, 100%. And the last thing I want to add here is just that as we know that dark side moved to black matter, our evil is still yet to be seen as an evolution here. But Black Matter just last month put out a ad for people who are willing to basically flip to the dark side, if you will, and actually be an insider threat, and they're willing to pay for that now, right? So I think this is something we're going to continue to see, is people who have a lot of privileges, who don't implement RBAC correctly. What's that going to look like for us in the future? And we got to pay attention to that as well.
100%. Peter, closing thoughts?
No, I think Joey covered it all.
Awesome. Let's jump into our next topic. And this one is talking about Microsoft fixes, right? So we're actually going to kick it over to Peter here in a moment, but this was actually a light patch Tuesday, and it had 7 critical bugs, right? So I think that's an interesting kind of baseline to take a look at, because if this was a light Tuesday, imagine what a heavy bug Tuesday or patch Tuesday looks like for Microsoft. Among Tuesday's 44 patches, 7 are critical and 37 are important. Now you can see at the bottom, a few of the critical ones were the LSA spoofing vulnerability and the print spooler remote code execution vulnerability. Peter, will you talk about a few of the vulnerabilities that were kind of top of mind for Microsoft?
Sure. Before I jump in, I just want to, highlight what you kind of outlined there, which is, Microsoft and their full suite of services and products that they offer has sort of ballooned so much that, 7 critical vulnerabilities and 44 total patches could actually look like a light month, given the fact that there are just so many different things that are going on in your network from a Microsoft perspective, including, file shares. You're talking email, web services, authentication. It runs the gambit. And so seeing that many vulnerabilities might seem on its face crazy, but in reality, the volume here is probably not the important thing to look at. The criticality of these really is. And additionally, something that you'll notice as we go through this is the lack of capability to handle it now that it's been discovered. Oftentimes there aren't patches available. Oftentimes patches don't work. Frequently detection mechanisms aren't very high fidelity. So, defenders are sort of caught in a tough place. And as we go through these, you'll see that sort of in its direct sense of how this affects defenders and their just utter lack of capability to handle this. But I wanted to hone in on the print spooler vulnerabilities simply because it was interesting how originally this was a single vulnerability that came out in, I believe, sometime in June, and actually then just sort of kept popping up where for some reason there was a great bit of attention on the print spooler service itself and how RPC interacts with that print spooler service, and it led to the discovery of 3 vulnerabilities in a row. The first vulnerability was pretty severe, and it did include remote code execution and basically like full capabilities for an attacker to just simply have network access and leverage that to gain further access. But that one was patched fairly rapidly and without too many hiccups. The second vulnerability was what we are calling Print Nightmare, and honestly, that's probably a good name for it, given the fact that this was really where things took a turn. And this vulnerability affected virtually every version of Windows that was running the Print Spooler service. This wasn't just domain-based, Active Directory-based things. This was also just endpoints themselves. So really, really broad capability here. And additionally, the worst part here was that Microsoft, again, rapidly put out some patches. Said patches did nothing. They did not actually prevent, not nothing, but ultimately there were workarounds for attackers that were very trivial to take advantage of, and that came out, I think, like the day after the patch was released. So it essentially, negated all of the patch, and it turned out that this was still an issue. The third vulnerability was actually announced in July, which is why we're talking about this at all, and it just added more to the mix, but fortunately, in this case, this one was much more limited, where although it had pretty broad capability, we're not sure quite which OSs it targeted and which OSs this is capable on. It seems fairly broad, but the good news here is that it wasn't just full remote code execution capability. You did have to actually have local execution capabilities on the host itself, but it was arbitrary code execution that led to privilege escalation as well. So still a pretty bad one, because it's pretty easy for attackers to land on target given the level of phishing, and as Joey mentioned, potential insider threat activities. So all they need is a little bit of access, and then all of a sudden they can escalate privileges, get domain admin, and move around wherever they want to go. So that one wasn't great. And just an anecdote from our operational handling of this incident, but we obviously Suricata signatures were pretty rapidly produced to identify this activity as well. But unfortunately, the signatures, at least in the very beginning especially, were very broad and detected really almost any interaction that had similar RPC calls to this service, which meant that lots of legitimate usage of that service was actually being triggered, or was triggering these alerts. And so from a Suricata standpoint and a signature-based standpoint, I mean, this is the typical reason why that's a problem. But this was a big issue because, again, defenders had virtually no capability to handle and detect this. And additionally, patches weren't working and weren't preventing this activity. So it just was kind of a painful month for us when we're just sort of handcuffed there. Even in our lab, when we were testing this, we weren't able to find a really conclusive set of these signatures or pattern of these signatures to use that would then indicate actual exploitation. We have limited it down to something a little bit more high fidelity, but ultimately it's still fairly high false positive rate on these detections. So not great for defenders.
And so, Peter, talk to me a little bit more. So we talked about Microsoft, right, having trouble keeping up with these, releasing patches that the next day attackers or pen testers or bug bounty hunters are able to maneuver around them very quickly. They have 180,000 employees at Microsoft. You got to think there's a chunk of those that are working patch management. But then we talk about companies like Kaseya, right, or Kaseya, and they have 2 months from the release of a vulnerability to get it out, or all of their customers are compromised and ransomed. I mean, this is really going to show, like, if you have a critical vulnerability, you don't have time to get the next roadmap item out. You have to address that now, right? I mean, talk to me a little bit more about that. What do you recommend?
Honestly, you're sort of cutting to the punchline here, because at the end of our discussion of Windows vulns, you'll notice, and I hope that my argument is justified with these examples. But I think that we're in a place where we've prioritized enablement and services and capability, and we haven't prioritized the security that's required to deliver said enablement, security, and so on. And really the core issue that I see here is that we're quick to push out a new feature, a new thing that makes administrators or developers' life easy, but we have little priority or little attention on the security angle of like, what are the impact of this? And not just from the perspective of, is this vulnerable, but can a user configure this in a vulnerable way that then leads to exploitation? And I think that's really the key here, is that we've lived in a world where the software developers put the onus on the user, and they say, well, if you configure it right, it's secure. And it's like, well, yes, but also we've got 15,000 different IT service things that are in our networks, and how am I supposed to, as an administrator of this, and with a limited amount of budget and time and expertise, how am I supposed to be the one who can learn all about your product and then configure it perfectly to not lead to exploitation? And so I think really that's what I would hope is the message here, is that, and Windows has honestly been doing a lot better in the recent past, but this shows that it's still an issue, is that I just hope that companies start looking at this and start taking responsibility on themselves to say, we can't just give you a secure thing that, if configured properly, is secure, that then if configured incorrectly isn't secure. You just can't do that anymore, because it's leading to massive issues within these networks. And that's going to continue to plague us if we don't readdress that approach.
I agree. And, I think a hot topic a couple of years ago was the whole sec DevOps thing, right? And what that really means is, hey, you have a security related professional working with your DevOps team. And I've been working with a lot of software companies now, like, and vendors. And I always ask that question. So like, what does that look like? Like, who's on your security team in that DevOps lifecycle? And it's really interesting to me that was so hot, and yet they rarely have a good answer to that question. So
Sure.
Really, really interesting. So Peter, closing thoughts, or are you ready to kick it over to Joey for the next and final one?
Actually, I'm going to take the next one. And this one is actually the Petit Potom NTLM relay attack. And the reason that we're calling this one out is exactly what I was just getting at, is that in this case, interestingly, this vulnerability, or I should say vulnerability, really is mostly a misconfiguration. And in fact, Windows said, we will not patch, we will not fix. This is not a vulnerability. It's actually just simply an exploitation of a misconfiguration. And so, again, yeah, my reaction to that is, if this is leading to full domain takeover, because the objective of this attack, and actually it's interesting, this particular attack was executed in almost the exact same way, but over the print spooler service, like we were talking about before, not related to the print spooler exploitations, but another way to trigger this type of relay attack was through the print spooler service. In this case, it was actually leveraging a different RPC call on a different service, specifically the EFS RPC open file raw call, which is related to the encrypting file system API that basically performs maintenance and management of encrypted data that is stored remotely but accessed over the network. So as such, this is a new way to exploit and sort of trigger a domain controller to try to authenticate to a malicious NTLM relay. And given that it would perform that authentication attempt, you can actually steal all the authentication materials and then leverage those authentication materials to become domain admin on a domain. So it's full domain takeover. And with simply network access, you were able to take advantage of this. And so again, you can see how in my opinion, and I would argue that it is unfair to put the onus on the defenders and the administrators of ensuring that this is configured correctly, when it leads to, simple network access leads to full domain takeover. I mean, that is something that you just, I do not understand how you can say, nope, we're not going to deal with that. That's on you. It is a massive hole in the service that you're providing to your customers. And I just don't know how we move past this world where, again, this onus is pushed onto the users and not onto Microsoft as the deliverer of the service.
Well, and so, okay, I'm going to bring out a little AWS fanboy in me for a minute, but like, they really lock down their service And if you want to enable a feature, you have to go in as the admin and enable it, right? So I think that's really where Microsoft needs to go. But what you mentioned in these RPC calls, like this is almost like going back to the days where we figured out cross-site scripting and we were attempting to use it everywhere, right? That's all they're doing here. And it's like, Microsoft, catch on. If they're using it one place, it's so much easier just to move around and try it against other API calls. So I think it's really interesting to see that. Once again, where's that red team and why aren't they trying it against all their services?
But Jill, I think that highlights kind of the issue here is that Microsoft is putting all its eggs in one basket with Azure, right? Azure gets all the love and care that, like, for example, the proxy logon vulnerability from months ago, that wasn't susceptible in Exchange Cloud. Why is that, right? But now on-prem customers are just left out in the dark. So
great ad, Joey.
Yeah,
no, you're so right. All right, Peter, and I apologize for saying that was the final one, but did you have one more?
We did indeed, Joey. What happened this month?
Yeah, Proxy Shell. So actually, really quick before I hop into it, I just want to get your guys' thoughts on this. The Exchange proxy logon vulnerability was reported back in January, and that was a private submission to Microsoft saying, "Hey, we have this vulnerability. It's being exploited, we think, by threat actors. Please patch it." Right, and then we didn't see a patch for months. Now, here's an example, right? Proxy Shell and Print Nightmare and all these other vulnerabilities that were publicly tweeted about. Say, hey, Microsoft, fix these. And so we have a private route and a public route, but we still see the response being months later. Just curious if you guys, I thought this as we were talking, like pros, cons to this?
I mean, I'll just say that if you look back at the Exchange hacks from the Bellium that leveraged this particular proxy logon vulnerability, the damage was devastating because before anybody knew about it, you saw just broad exploitation, and it's really difficult to speculate on what would have happened if it was publicly known prior. But at the same time, I have to admit to myself that given the fact that it was private, there was a period of time where attackers could take advantage of this without defenders even knowing to look for it. And so, regardless of the fact of if defenders would look for it, given the fact that they knew about it, who knows? That's where we're just sort of parsing, mincing words here. But ultimately, there has to be some kind of comment to, if it's publicly known, at least we can look for it, and at least those more forward-leaning organizations can address that vulnerability. So really tricky one there.
Yeah,
no, really tricky. Well, Joey, let me kick up the infographic you sent over for this, and I'll kick it back over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Proxy Shell, this is the kind of evolution here a little bit to Proxy Logon, although I will put out here first, this is mitigated by a patch already. So what is Proxy Shell? Proxy Shell, it's the name of really 3 vulnerabilities that perform unauthenticated remote code execution on Microsoft Exchange servers when chained together. And these chain vulnerabilities are exploited remotely through the Microsoft Exchange Client Access Service. And so this is what I kind of want to show you guys here with this infographic is. This is kind of, I stole this from OrangeSide's a briefing here. This is what they're discussing, him and his team. OrangeSide's a popular security researcher, and he briefed this over, I think it was DEF CON this year. And this is kind of the attack surface we're really focusing on right now. This is the attack surface that's kind of been perhaps neglected in the past. So, like I said, 2 of the CVEs already patched back in April of this year, while the other one being patched in May of this year. And what it takes advantage of, Proxy Shell attack, is the Microsoft Exchange Auto-Discover service. And so the Auto-Discover service, this assists you when you're onboarding, and say, a new member on your team, and they want to use the Microsoft Outlook application on your Windows computer or perhaps Mac or whatever. But when you actually go to type in your information to say, hey, this is my Exchange server, I have an account there, that Auto-Discover service helps you and helps the end user onboard that Outlook client without having to type in, name and port and all these other configuration issues. And so attackers are now exploiting the Auto-Discover/Auto-Discover JSON path in this web application. And what happens when you actually do successfully go after it is IES then writes out and executes these commands on the Microsoft Exchange server. So obviously not great there. So again, like I said, for mitigation, the proxy shell vulnerabilities have already been patched, and we don't think this will be as successful as the proxy logon attacks that occurred in March. But I guess I should not be surprised anymore. I was in the sysadmin subreddit, and I was watching folks comment on this from different organizations. What they were saying was a lot of companies have actually held off on these patches, and so there's actually about 400,000 unpatched exchange servers out there in the world today. That's from Shodan. Whether those be a handful of them be sandboxes or what have you, but a lot of them are for legitimate purposes, right? There's actual businesses out there. And so what the folks were saying on the subreddit was that the new patch adds in support for AMSI. AMSI is an anti-malware scanner interface that helps AV products gain greater visibility into things happening on the OS level. But AV products like Sophos actually weren't playing nice with this update, and were causing the CPU usage on your Microsoft Exchange server to spike to over 100%. So now you're like DOSing yourself, right? So you can't win, right? If you don't patch, right, you have vulnerabilities, and then if you do patch, there's an issue with your AV. You can't seem to win as a sysadmin, right? You never have a good day. So the workaround here, we disabling support for MSI and your Sophos. So yeah, it's still enabled, but perhaps your visibility is now degraded. And folks are still rocking Exchange 2013 that they're mentioning, right? So I think this is a good push to say, hey, if you don't have the expertise, the time, and the money, and the effort to actually put into on-prem Exchange, this is a good, again, push to move towards cloud Exchange. But for folks who are still on it, this is, again, an ongoing issue for them, right? Joel, I think you're muted.
I was just saying that's a great ad, and I think it comes back to Windows, Microsoft's pricing strategy as well, that it's keeping people on these older versions. So that's a whole conversation of its own. Real quick, I know we're 36 minutes in, so we do have to wrap up. But Peter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, I just want to point out that I hope that the last two especially, but all three of those vulnerabilities highlights the fact that we just can't keep going on like we are here and expecting people to defend their way through these solutions. We've got to do more on the software supply chain, software development, all of that side, because it's not reasonable. Ultimately, whether it's fair, whether it's right, who's responsible, all of these questions don't matter. At the end of the day, we want to get better at defending ourselves. And we've seen that historically, it is not going to happen by forcing security on the companies, saying, hey, you got to do better, secure your stuff, do this. It's not going to happen. Whether that be the right answer, whether that be the responsible party, it just doesn't matter. It's not a viable solution. We're going to continue to struggle with this if we don't address it at the source.
And Peter, I'm going to be completely blunt here, but that's honestly one of the reasons why I respect you so much, is because you get right down to the point, right? None of that matters except the fact we need to help these organizations defend themselves better. So once again, Peter, thank you for being here. Joey, I love the insights. Thank you for joining us. We had prepared to dig into a number of other topics, including Accenture being impacted by ransomware, the changes Apple is doing to defend minors in iCloud and in messaging, but we have run out of time. So if it is still relevant, which I'm sure it will be next month, you'll have to join us next month on our monthly Cyber Lookback. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks a lot, Joel.
Thanks, Joe.
Have a great day, everybody.